Bitter Creek, Idaho, January 1883. The man reached for her, and Evelyn Montgomery drove her hairpin straight through the back of his hand. He made a sound she'd never heard a human being make before. She was already moving, the ledger locked under her arm, frozen mud cracking beneath her boots, Kincaid's voice splitting the air behind her. Don't let her reach that door. She hit the door at a dead run. Cold slammed into her face like a fist. The mountains ahead were already disappearing into white, brutal, indifferent, and the only direction that didn't belong to Cyrus Kincaid. She ran straight into the blizzard. How far will she go to stay free? And what will she find on the other side of the storm? Read the full story and find out what the blizzard was hiding. The stagecoach smelled like wet wool and other people's misery. Evelyn Montgomery had been sitting in it for 11 days. 11 days of frozen mountain passes, bad biscuits, and a bench seat that had no business calling itself furniture. She'd shared the cabin with a fur trapper who snored and a traveling preacher who quoted scripture every time the wheels hit a rock. By the time the coach lurched to a stop at Bitter Creek, she was ready to get out and walk the rest of the way to the moon if she had to. She stepped down onto the platform, and the cold hit her, like a door swinging open on winter itself. Idaho, January. The sky was the color of dirty pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the mountains like a thumb on a bruise. The wind came off the peaks in long, sustained pulls that found every gap in her coat, a sage-green wool thing that had been perfectly fashionable on Beacon Hill was not built for this. Boston cold was damp and miserable. This cold was something else. This cold had teeth. She tugged her collar up and looked around. Bitter Creek Way Station was a collection of low timber buildings huddled against the hillside like they were afraid of the sky. A livery stable, a trading post with a warped sign, a two-story structure that might have been a hotel in a more optimistic man's imagination, and at the far end of the boardwalk, a plank-sided office with a new iron stovepipe punching through the roof, and a hand-painted sign above the door, Kincaid Land and Transport. That was where she was supposed to go. She pulled her one good traveling bag off the luggage rack herself. The driver had already moved on to more important things and picked her way across the frozen mud toward the office. Her situation was, she had to admit, not ideal. Her father had died 8 months ago, and he'd taken everything with him. The house, the accounts, the careful fiction of Montgomery prosperity. What he'd left behind was a stack of debts and a daughter, with a first-rate education and no way to use it. She could do mathematics in her head faster than most men could do it on paper. She could keep a ledger, manage accounts, write contracts. None of that was worth a cent to Boston society without a dowry to go with it. The newspaper advertisement had seemed like providence. Respectable rancher in Idaho Territory seeks literate woman of good character. Position includes bookkeeping responsibilities and possibility of marriage. Travel expenses provided. Her uncle had arranged the correspondence. She'd signed the papers, packed her bag, and told herself this was the practical choice, the brave choice. She pushed open the office door. The warmth inside was immediate and welcome. Iron stove in the corner, logs crackling, a good orange heat radiating across the plank floor. A desk dominated the center of the room, covered in papers and leather-bound ledgers. 2 oil lamps burned on the wall. The room smelled like wood smoke and pipe tobacco. Nobody was there. She set her bag down next to the stove and flexed her fingers, trying to get the feeling back in them. Through the thin interior wall to her left, she could hear voices. 2 men. She wasn't trying to listen. But the walls in this country, she was learning, were not built for privacy. The uncle's debt stands at $400. A smooth voice, controlled, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who never raised it because he never needed to. She came on that debt. She'll work it off. She's a bookkeeper. A second voice, flat and professional, like a man discussing lumber prices. She's a woman alone in the Idaho Territory, with no family and no money. A pause, a chair scraping. At the Silver Ridge house, she'll have a room, 3 meals, and all the company she can handle. Tell Hawkins to be polite about it. I don't want a scene at the way station. The Silver Ridge house. Evelyn had never been to Silver Ridge, but she had read the newspapers. She knew what Silver Ridge was known for, and she knew what kind of houses operated there, and she understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the weather outside, exactly what was happening. Her uncle's debt. Probably fake. Probably manufactured from the moment her name appeared on that advertisement. A literate woman. Good character. No family, no money, no one coming to look for her. She had been bought before she ever set foot on the stagecoach. She stood very still and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly 3 seconds. The fear was real. She didn't pretend otherwise. Her heart was hammering, and her hands had gone cold for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. 3 seconds. She allowed herself that. Then she started looking around the room. The desk was covered in ledgers. Most of them were standard account books. She could tell by the worn spines, the ordinary brown covers. But one of them was different, thicker. Bound in dark green leather with a brass clasps, sitting slightly apart from the others, the way important things sometimes sat apart from ordinary ones. She crossed to the desk. She opened it. What she found on those pages was not a ranch's accounts. Names, dates, numbers beside them that were too large to be ordinary wages. County officials, she recognized 2 names from the newspapers. Property descriptions, transfer amounts, dates of acquisition. And buried further back, in cramped columns, something that turned her stomach completely over, lists of women, first names only. Beside each one, a debt figure and a date of arrival. This was evidences. Real evidence, the kind that could put a man in front of a federal judge. She heard boots in the back room. Movement. The conversation was wrapping up. She closed the ledger, tucked it under her arm, and gripped it tight against her ribs. Her hairpin was silver, heavy, a thick brass cord thing with a decorative top that her mother had given her. She pulled it free from her hair. She had one advantage, and she knew it. Nobody in that back room expected her to do anything, except sit quietly and wait to be told her fate. They thought she was the kind of woman who accepted what men decided for her. They thought education was only dangerous in a man. The back door opened. The enforcer came through first. He was a lean man with a weathered face and pale, assessing eyes. He took one look at her, standing in the middle of the room, the ledger under her arm, the hairpin in her hand, and his expression shifted from professional calm to something sharper. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you'll want to put that ledger back." "I don't think I will," Evie said. He reached for her. She drove the hairpin into the back of his outstretched hand. Not a tentative jab. A full, deliberate strike, the brass tip punching between the tendons. He made a sound she'd never heard a human being make before, shock and pain and genuine surprise, all at once, and yanked his hand back. She was already moving. Through the front door, off the porch, onto the frozen mud of Bitter Creek's Main Street before he'd finished cursing. She heard shouting behind her. She didn't look back. The wind had picked up while she was inside. The sky had dropped lower, darker, and the first snow was starting to fall, not gentle flakes, but small, hard pellets that stung where they hit her face. The mountain ahead of her was already disappearing into white. Going back to the stagecoach was not an option. The driver would hand her over. The trading post, she thought about it for half a step, and kept running. Any business in this town either answered to Kincaid or was afraid of him. There was only one direction that didn't belong to Cyrus Kincaid yet. She chose the mountain. The storm swallowed her whole within the first 100 yards. The cold wrapped around her like something alive. Her thin city coat was useless. Her boots were soaked through before she'd gone a quarter mile, and the trees ahead of her were just dark shapes dissolving into white. She pressed the ledger harder against her chest. She kept moving, she thought. My father raised me to solve problems, she thought. My mother raised me to endure discomfort, she thought. I did not come all this way to become someone's property. Her body would outlast her fear. She chose to believe that. She walked until she couldn't, and then she walked a little more. The shack had been abandoned long enough that the snow came through the roof in two places. Evie found it by accident, or maybe by the desperate logic of a body that was shutting down and still trying, on some animal level, to survive. She'd been walking for what felt like hours. Her feet had stopped hurting around. The time they stopped feeling anything at all, which she understood, in some distant corner of her mind, was not a good sign. The blizzard had closed around her completely. No sky, no ground, no sense of direction, just white and wind and the cedar smell of cold, so deep it went past sensation into something else entirely. The shack was a dark shape against all that white. She pushed the door open with her shoulder. The latch was frozen, and her fingers were useless and fell inside. Four walls, a dirt floor, a rusted iron stove in the corner with half a cord of old wood stacked beside it. The roof had gaps, but it had a roof, and that was more than the open mountain had offered her. She got the stove lit on her fourth try. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped the matches twice, and both times she made herself pick them up and start over. Because stopping was not a strategy she was willing to entertain. The fire caught small and mean, and she fed it carefully, the way her father had taught her on camping trips when she was 9 years old, before the money and the society life had swallowed everything simple. She sat down with her back against the wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and opened the green ledger across her lap. She read for as long as she could keep her eyes open. What was in those pages was worse than she'd initially understood. Kincaid wasn't just running brothels and bribing county officials. He was systematically acquiring land from homesteaders who couldn't pay the debts he'd manufactured for them, the same mechanism he'd tried to use on her. Families displaced, properties transferred for a fraction of their value. And the names of the women in those back columns there were 11 of them over the past 2 years. 11 women brought to Silver Ridge under false pretenses. She thought about all 11 of them and felt something harden in her chest that wasn't cold at all. She tucked the ledger inside her coat against her body to keep it dry. At some point, she stopped being able to feel her feet completely, and the shivering that had been violent and constant began to slow, which she also knew was not a good sign. When the body stops fighting the cold, it's because the body has started to accept it. She pressed her back harder against the wall and told herself to stay awake. She didn't manage it. Tad Thorne almost missed the smoke. He and Jesse had been out since before dawn, checking the trap line that ran along the eastern edge of their property. And by midday, the blizzard had turned serious enough that even Jesse, who had tracked through worse conditions than most men would consider survivable, had suggested they cut back toward the ranch. They were on the return leg, heads down against the wind, horses moving, with the slow, deliberate care of animals that understood ice, when Tad caught it, just a thread of gray, rising from the tree line off to their left, darker than the storm, and going the wrong direction for a natural fire. He pulled up his horse. Jesse was beside him in a second, looking where Tad was looking, reading the same smoke signal. "Old Kettle's shack," Jesse said. He kept his voice flat and his face neutral, but his eyes were already moving, cataloging the intensity of the smoke, the wind direction, what it meant that someone had managed to start a fire in this weather. "Trapper hasn't used it in 2 seasons. Tad didn't answer. He was already moving toward it. They tied the horses to the leeward side of the shack and went through the door. Together, Jesse first by habit, hand on his rifle. What they found inside was not the poacher or the Kincaid scout either of them had been ready for. It was a young woman, sitting against the wall, with her knees pulled up and her head tilted at the wrong angle. For sleep, her coat was worthless. Her lips had gone blue-gray at the edges. Her hands were tucked under her arms, which meant some part of her had known enough to protect them. But the skin on her face was chalk white and wrong in a way Tad had learned to recognize during the war. 3 winters in the field had taught him what a body looked like when the cold was winning. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pressed his fingers to her throat. A pulse, faint and unsteady, but there, she's alive, he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. He kept his fingers where they were for a second longer, feeling that small, stubborn beat against his fingertips, and something moved through him that he hadn't expected, not just relief, which would have been rational, but something more urgent than that, something protective and immediate, like a door opening in a room he'd kept locked for a long time. He pulled his hand back and looked at Jesse. Jesse was already stripping off his outer coat. They didn't waste time talking about it. Between the two of them, they'd handled enough cold-weather casualties to know that every minute counted, and that sentiment was a luxury for later. Jesse wrapped his coat around her upper body. While Tad lifted her, she was lighter than she should have been, which told its own story about 11 days on a stagecoach and a foot race through a blizzard. She didn't wake up. She made a small sound when he shifted her weight, something between a breath and a protest, and he adjusted his grip carefully. "The ledger," Jesse said. He'd spotted it inside her coat. He didn't touch it, just noted it. Jesse was like that. He saw everything and spoke only what mattered. "Leave it with her," Tad said. They made it back to Iron Ridge Ranch in just under 2 hours. The horses knew the way home, even in whiteout conditions, which was one of several reasons Tad had paid good money for them. Barty had the barn doors open. Before they'd cleared the tree line, he'd been watching for them, and by the time Tad carried Evie through the front door of the main cabin, Barty already had water heating on the stove and extra wool blankets pulled from the cedar chest. "What happened to her?" Barty asked. "Blizzard got her," Jesse said, hanging up his wet coat. "She made it to Kettle's shack on her own. Started the fire herself." Barty looked at the woman in Tad's arms with wide, careful eyes. "Is she going to be okay?" "Depends on the next few hours," Tad said. He carried her through to the back bedroom, the one they kept for the rare occasion of a guest, which had never actually happened until now, and laid her down on the bed. "Barty, I need tepid water. Not hot, not warm, tepid. You understand the difference?" "Not hot," Barty repeated, already turning back toward the kitchen. "Got it." Jesse appeared in the doorway. He'd changed into dry clothes in under 2 minutes, which was a skill he'd developed out of necessity. "Her boots first," he said. "Her feet look bad." They were. Tad pulled her boots off with steady, careful hands and checked her feet, the way an Army field medic had once shown him, pressing gently at the toes and the heel, checking color and texture. Frostbite was already beginning in 2 toes, on the left foot, white and waxy. No sensation when he pressed. The right foot was better, cold and mottled, but not beyond recovery. "We don't use direct heat," he told Jesse, though Jesse already knew. "No fire, no hot water. We warm her, slow." The reasoning was not complicated, but it was not obvious either, and it cost men their limbs when they got it wrong. Frozen tissue was fragile. Heat applied too fast caused blood to rush back into vessels that couldn't handle it, and the result was rupture, blackening, permanent damage. The Army had learned this the hard way in the first winter campaigns, and Tad had carried that knowledge with him out of the war, like most of the other things he'd carried quietly, without ceremony, because it was useful, and usefulness was what he believed in. They warmed her in stages. Tepid water on her feet in a shallow basin. Wool blankets layered from the inside out, the first one slightly cool, the ones on top progressively warmer as her body temperature began to rise. Jesse worked snow against the frostbitten toes in slow circles, which seemed counterintuitive, but encouraged blood flow without shock. Barty heated broth on the stove and kept it at the right temperature by testing it against his own wrist every few minutes, which Tad had taught him to do the winter before, when a ranch hand had come in half-frozen from a fence line accident. It took the rest of the afternoon. She came back to consciousness in pieces, a tightening around the eyes first, then a sharper breath. Her hands moved, and Tad saw them close around the ledger that he'd placed beside her, still inside the fold of her coat, and her grip tightened on it even before her eyes opened. He noted that, whatever was in that book, she'd walked into a blizzard to protect it. Her eyes opened just before dark. Brown eyes, sharp and dark. And the first thing they did was move ceiling, walls, window, men. She cataloged the room the same way. Jessie cataloged a trail. She was calculating threat before she'd even fully arrived back in her own body. And Tad found himself respecting that involuntarily. Her lips moved. He leaned forward slightly. "What? Not going back," she said. Her voice was barely there, rough and raw and small, but there was nothing small about the intention behind it. "Nobody's sending you back anywhere," Tad said. He meant it plainly. He said it plainly. "You're at Iron Ridge Ranch. You're safe for tonight. Rest." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away because he had nothing to hide, and he'd found, over the years, that people could tell the difference between a man who meant what he said and a man who was saying what seemed useful. Then something shifted in her expression, not trust exactly, but a provisional willingness to wait and see, and she closed her eyes again. Barty appeared at the bedroom door with a mug of broth, holding it out like an offering. "Is she awake?" "She was," Tad said quietly. "She'll be up again. Leave the broth." Jesse leaned against the doorframe, with his arms crossed, watching the sleeping woman with the focused, unreadable expression he wore when he was thinking something through. "She's got a Kincaid ledger," he said. "I know that's going to bring trouble to this door." "I know that too," Tad said. Jesse nodded slowly. That was the end of the conversation, because they'd known each other long enough that some discussions didn't need finishing. They both understood what came next, and they were both already deciding they were all right with it. Tad sat in the chair by the window and listened to the blizzard throw itself against the shutters, and he stayed there until the fire burned low and the woman in the bed was breathing steadily and warm, her hands still wrapped around that leather-bound ledger like she'd carry it right through whatever came. For her next, he thought she probably would. She woke up properly on the second morning, not the fragmented, fevered surfacing of the first day, when she'd opened her eyes twice, registered the ceiling and the warmth, and sunk back under without really engaging with either. This was a real waking up. Full consciousness, full memory, arriving together, and all at once, the way bad news tends to arrive. Evie lay still for a moment and did an inventory. She was in a bed, a real one with a straw mattress and wool blankets that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. The ceiling above her was bare timber, well fitted, the gaps chinked properly with what looked like clay and horsehair. A small iron stove occupied the far corner, banked down but still putting out heat. Morning light came through a single window, gray, white, and clean, the particular quality of light that came after a heavy snowfall. Her feet ached, not badly, but persistently, the specific complaint of flesh that had been very cold and was now remembering what warmth felt like. Her hands were fine. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt, dark blue, worn soft, far too large for her, and she did not want to think too carefully about the logistics of how she'd come to be wearing it. The ledger was on the small table beside the bed. She reached for it before she reached for anything else, opened it, checked the pages, still intact. She set it back and sat up slowly and took stock. She was not restrained. The bedroom door was closed, but she could see from where she sat that there was no external bolt, no padlock, nothing that suggested she was locked in. She was simply in a room with a closed door, which was a situation she was entirely capable of addressing. She stood up, her legs held. She crossed to the window and looked out. The world outside was white and enormous. Snow covered everything: the yard, the fence lines, the outbuildings she could see through the glass. There were two structures beyond the main cabin, a large barn and what looked like a workshop, with fresh sawdust packed into the snow around its base. The mountains rose behind all of it, white-peaked and massive, filling the upper half of the window completely. She could see no road, no other structures. Nothing that indicated town or neighbors or any of the things that might have been useful. She was a long way from everywhere. The door opened behind her. She turned around. A young man stood in the doorway, maybe 25, with sandy hair and an open, earnest face that was doing its best to project reassurance. He was holding a tray with a bowl and a mug on it, and he looked so genuinely pleased that she was upright, that she almost said something kind before she remembered to be guarded. "You're awake," he said. "Really awake, I mean." "Good morning. I'm Barty Bartholomew Clay, but nobody calls me that. It's a whole mouthful. How are your feet?" "Sore," she said. "That's good." He came in and set the tray on the table, keeping his movements slow and visible, the way a person does when they're trying not to startle something. Sore means they're coming back right. If they'd gone numb on you, that'd be the problem. "You want to eat?" "It's oatmeal. I put dried apples in it." Jessie said that sounded ridiculous, but I thought it sounded like something a person from the city might appreciate. She looked at the oatmeal. She was, she realized, absolutely ravenous. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate, and Barty stood by the door with his hands in his pockets and talked, because he was clearly the kind of person who filled silence naturally and without self-consciousness. He told her, unprompted, that she'd been out for nearly 2 full days, that her feet had a touch of frostbite on the left side, but nothing that wouldn't heal clean, that the blizzard had passed yesterday afternoon, and the temperature had come up some. He told her the ranch was called Iron Ridge. He told her she was in Idaho. "I know I'm in Idaho," she said. "Right. Of course." He smiled, a little sheepish. "Sorry. You had a long couple of days. I wasn't sure how much was coming through." She finished the oatmeal. She drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed. Then she set the mug down and looked at Barty directly. "Where are the other 2? He blinked. "How'd you know there were other 2? 3 sets of boots by the door when you came in. 3 chairs at the table I can see through the doorway. 3 coffee cups on the shelf." She paused. "I pay attention." Barty stared at her for a second, then broke into a wide grin. "Tad said you had a head on your shoulders. He's outside doing the morning check on the stock." Jessie went to look at the lower fence line. The storm knocked some posts over on the south side. He paused. "They'll both want to talk to you once you're ready. All 3 of us, actually. There are some things we need to say." "I imagine there are," Evie said. She dressed her own clothes, had been cleaned and dried, and folded on the chair by the window, which she noted and filed away, and came out into the main room of the cabin. It was a good room. Large, low-ceilinged, practical in the way that working spaces become practical over years of actual use. A long table dominated the center, scarred and honest. The kitchen occupied one wall, proper iron stove, good size, with pots hung above it in descending order. Shelves of provisions along the adjacent wall, organized with more care than she would have expected from 3 men living alone. A stone fireplace at the far end, burning steadily. The floors were bare plank but swept clean. She went to the fireplace and stood with her back to it, warming herself, and waited. Tad came in first. She recognized him from the shack, the big man who'd pressed his fingers to her throat to check her pulse. He was larger in full daylight than she'd registered through the blur of hypothermia. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who believed in clean lines, and the kind of economy of movement that came from a body that had been trained to conserve energy over long distances. He had a scar running from his left ear down to the angle of his jaw, silver white and old. He looked at her standing by his fireplace, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Then it settled back into something measured and direct, and he pulled off his hat and gave her a nod. "Miss Montgomery," he said. "Good to see you on your feet. Thank you for the bed," she said, "and the flannel shirt." "Barty's idea," he said, without expanding on that. Jessie came in 2 minutes later, snow still on his shoulders, and shut the door behind him with his boot. He was leaner than Tad, darker, with high cheekbones and black eyes that took in the whole room in a single pass. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her, and she had the clear sense that she was being assessed not rudely, just thoroughly, the way a person assesses something that matters and deserves to be gotten right. "Your color's better," he said. It was neither a compliment nor small talk. It was a clinical observation offered as information, and she appreciated the honesty of it. "I feel better," she said. Barty was already at the stove, pouring coffee. He brought 3 mugs to the table and set them down, then pulled out a chair and sat in it, and looked at the other 2 expectantly, like a person who knew a conversation was coming and wanted to make sure it happened properly. Tad sat at the head of the table. Jesse pulled out a chair sideways and straddled it with his arms resting across the back. Evie looked at the 3 of them arranged around the table, and then, with the deliberateness of a woman who was not going to be talked at, while standing in a corner, she pulled out a chair for herself and sat down. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tad leaned forward and put his forearms on the table and looked at her straight. "You're no servant, Miss Montgomery," he said. His voice was deep and measured. "We don't want a maid." She held his gaze. "Then what do you want?" Jesse shifted in his chair. "We need a partner willing to stand beside us on this harsh land." He said it without drama or decoration, the way he'd said everything so far as a simple statement of fact that happened to carry weight. "This ranch doesn't run itself. The 3 of us have been making do for too long with too many gaps." Barty leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and his face earnest as morning. "We've lived like wild animals too long," he said. "We need a wife, and we're here to prove we'll respect her." The word sat in the room. Wife. Evie looked at all 3 of them in turn. She had walked into a blizzard to avoid becoming someone's possession. She had read Kincaid's ledger, which cataloged 11 women whose choices had been made for them by men with money and leverage. She had survived 2 days of near death, with nothing but a brass hairpin and a stolen book, and a complete unwillingness to accept the life someone else had designed for her. "That's a significant word," she said. "It is," Tad said. He didn't flinch from it. "3 of you," she said. "3 of us," Jessie confirmed. She could have said a great many things. She could have lectured them on the legal impossibility of what they were describing, or delivered a prepared speech on the dignity of women, or pointed out that she had come to Idaho to keep books and build a reasonable life and had not signed up for this particular arrangement. All of that was true. All of it was somewhere in her head, ready. What came out instead was, what's to stop this from being exactly what I already ran from? The question landed clearly. None of the 3 men looked away from it. Tad reached into his coat and pulled out 2 things. He set them on the table between them and pushed them toward her. One was a small Derringer pistol, loaded she could tell by the weight of it when she picked it up. The other was a key, plain iron, sized for a standard door lock. "That's your bedroom key," Tad said. "The lock is on the inside. Nobody comes through that door without your say-so." He held her eyes steady. "And that's a loaded gun. You keep it. If any one of us ever makes you afraid in this house, you use it." She turned the Derringer over in her hand, checked the load, set it down carefully. Barrel pointed toward the wall. "And if I decide I don't want any of this," she said. "If I want out. Come spring, when the trail is clear enough to travel safe," Tad said, "we take you to the federal marshal in Helena ourselves. You give him that ledger in your coat. Kincaid gets what's coming to him, and you walk away from Iron Ridge with enough provisions for a fresh start." He said it like a contract term, because that was exactly what it was. No obligation, no debt, no conditions. "We're not Kincaid," Jesse said. He said it simply. "We're not asking you to pay anything. We're asking you to consider." Barty was looking at her with those open eyes, not pushing, just waiting. He reminded her, suddenly and painfully, of her younger brother, who had died of fever when they were both children, that same quality of genuine without guile, warm without calculation. She looked at the key in her hand. The marsh ahead was this. Kincaid was still out there. His ledger was under her arm, and his enforcer had her face memorized, and his money controlled the county sheriff. Spring was months away. The trail to Helena was currently buried under 6 feet of snow. She had nowhere to go, and the alternatives, trusting to a town where Kincaid had eyes, attempting the mountain again in winter, were not alternatives at all. And there was something else, something more honest than strategy. These three men had carried her off a mountain in a blizzard, warmed her back to life by careful degrees, cleaned her clothes and let her sleep, and asked absolutely nothing while she was vulnerable. They had sat down at a table with her and said, "We need you," without making it a threat or a transaction. They had put a gun in her hand and called it hers. She had never had a man put a weapon in her hand and tell her to use it if she needed to. Every man in her life before this had, in one way or another, made her smaller. Even her father, who had loved her, had spent his life solving her problems rather than teaching her to solve them herself. She closed her fingers around the key. "I'll stay through spring," she said. "I'll work. I'll keep your books, if they need keeping. And from what I saw of Barty's face when I mentioned mathematical fractions this morning, they need keeping." Barty had the grace to look slightly caught. "I'll decide about the rest of it as we go." Tad gave a single nod, like a man who'd offered a fair deal and received a fair answer, and was satisfied. Jesse uncrossed his arms and straightened up, and the slight, barely visible loosening of his shoulders told her that he'd been carrying more tension than he'd shown. Barty broke into his wide grin. "I'll make a real breakfast," he announced, pushing back from the table. "We've got eggs, and I'm putting dried apples in everything, Jesse, because it's good." Jesse looked at the ceiling. Evie looked around the table, the scarred wood, the three coffee mugs, the window behind Tad's shoulder, showing the white mountains and the clean blue sky coming in behind them, as the storm fully cleared, and felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off a stagecoach into the cold, like she might have made a choice instead of had one made for her. She put the key in her pocket. She kept the Derringer close. She stayed. The ledgers were a disaster. Evie sat at the kitchen table on her third morning at Iron Ridge, a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and worked through what passed for the ranch's financial records. There were 4 books total. One was a cattle log that doubled as a weather journal, which was creative but not useful. One was a receipts book that someone, probably Barty, based on the handwriting, which was enthusiastic and slightly chaotic, had been using to record expenses in no particular order, and with no consistent unit of currency. One was a proper ledger that Tad had apparently started 2 years ago, kept faithfully for about 6 weeks, and then abandoned mid-entry. The fourth was a notebook filled entirely with Jesse's drawings of animal tracks, which was beautiful and completely unrelated to ranch accounting. She set that one aside respectfully and got to work on the others. By mid-morning, she had a clear picture of Iron Ridge's finances, and the picture was this. The ranch was not failing, but it was not thriving either. There was cattle revenue, timber rights, income, and occasional fees from helping neighboring homesteaders with survey work. Against that sat equipment costs, feed expenses, payroll for 2 seasonal hands who came in during branding, and a property tax bill that Evie could see, by reading between the numbers, had been paid late for the past 3 years. Not because there wasn't money, because nobody had been tracking when it was due. She made a new column. She labeled it Upcoming Obligations. She filled it in neatly with dates. Tad came in around noon to refill his coffee and stopped when he saw what she'd done to his table. She had spread the 4 books across the full length of it, along with 3 sheets of blank paper she'd found in the desk drawer, all of which were now covered in her handwriting columns, figures, a timeline running left to right, across the bottom of the largest sheet. "The property tax," she said without looking up. "You owe it in 42 days. If you sell the 8 steers you've got separated in the East Pen, and you should sell them, they're ready, and the market in Silver Ridge will be better before the spring thaw than after. When everyone else's cattle come available, you'll cover the tax and have enough left to the barn hinge mechanism Barty's been putting off fixing." Tad stood there holding his coffee cup and looked at the papers. "The East Pen steers," he said slowly. You've been holding them because you thought the price might come up in April. It won't. Feed prices go up in spring, not cattle prices. You're spending money waiting to make money. She looked up then. I'm not telling you what to do. You asked for a bookkeeper. This is what bookkeeping looks like when it's done right. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her timeline. He looked at the figures she'd compiled. He was quiet for a long time, which she'd already learned was how he processed things, not slow, just thorough. The East Penn steers, he said again, and this time he was nodding. Send them to market before the end of February, she said. I'll write up the numbers properly so you have documentation for the buyer. He looked at her across the table. My father kept these books before he died. I kept them after. I did my best with them. Your best was better than nothing, she said, because it was true, and she believed in saying true things. But you've been ranching, not accounting. They're different skills. You don't apologize for not knowing how to track an elk. Don't apologize for this either. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Tad Thorne was not a man who did anything dramatically, but she caught it. A loosening, slight, and real. Fair enough, he said. He stood up, took his coffee, and went back out to the yard. She went back to the ledger. That was how it started. Between her and the ranch. Not with ceremony, but with work, which was, she was coming to understand, how most honest things started. Barty came to her 2 days later, with a set of drawings spread across the workbench in his shop. He was designing an expansion to the barn, a second hay storage level, accessed by a ramp system he'd engineered himself, with a counterweight mechanism to make the heavy doors operable by one person. The drawings were impressive. The load calculations scrawled in the margins were not. You've got your weight distribution wrong, she said, studying the numbers. You've calculated the counterweight as if the ramp is a single lever, but it's a compound system. You need to account for the friction at each pivot point. Otherwise, you're going to size the counterweight too small and the doors won't stay up. Barty stared at her. I've been building things for 6 years, and you've been doing it by feel and experience, which is genuinely impressive. But feel and experience can't tell you why a mechanism works, only that it does. If you understand the math behind it, you can design things you've never built before, instead of improving on things you already have. He was quiet for a moment. Then, show me. She showed him. She pulled a blank sheet from her coat pocket she'd taken to carrying them and drew a simplified version of his mechanism, labeling each force and each pivot. She walked him through the calculations slowly, step by step, asking him to tell her the next number before she wrote it. So he was doing the thinking, and she was just providing the framework. By the end of it, Barty had corrected his own counterweight calculation, found an error in his ramp angle, and was staring at the paper with the slightly stunned expression of a person who had just discovered a new room in a house they thought they knew completely. That's mathematics, he said. Structural mathematics, she confirmed. Every building you've ever put up has been full of it. You just haven't been able to see it before. He looked at her with something close to reverence. Can we do this again? With the water wheel design I've been working on? Bring it tomorrow morning, she said. She was in Jesse's territory by the end of the first week. He didn't invite her, exactly. What happened was that she stepped outside early on a Tuesday morning to clear her head and found him crouched at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, looking at something in the snow. She walked over, because she was curious by nature, and suppressing curiosity had never done her any good. He glanced at her when she stopped beside him. He looked back at the snow. There were tracks. She could see that much a pattern of impressions leading from the trees across the open ground toward the creek. She had no idea what had made them. Mountain lion, Jesse said. Female. Came through around 3 this morning, heading east toward the lower creek. He pointed with one finger, tracing the path. See how the rear paw overlaps the front print here? She's moving slow, probably hunting, not traveling. Evie crouched down to look at the tracks more closely. How do you know it's a female? He looked at her a quick, assessing look, checking whether the question was genuine. Apparently satisfied, he said, sighs. And the stride pattern. Males are heavier, longer stride, deeper impression, even at the same speed. A tom's rear overstep is wider. Females tend to track tighter. He put his finger just inside the edge of the print without touching it. She's also not front-heavy. She hasn't made a kill recently. She's hungry, Evie said. She'll move on. There's nothing for her here that's worth the risk of the buildings. He stood up, brushed snow from his knee. But I'll keep an eye on the east fence for the next few days. They stood there for a moment in the early morning cold. Jesse wasn't a comfortable silence. Kind of person. Exactly, he wasn't uncomfortable either. He simply existed in quiet without needing to fill it, which was unusual enough that she found herself matching it. Will you teach me? She said. The tracking. He looked at her steadily. Why? Because this is where I live now, at least until spring, and I'd rather understand the land I'm standing on than be afraid of it. He considered her for a longer moment than most people would have taken. Then he said, tomorrow morning. Wear your boots, not the city ones. Barty made you a pair there on the porch. She hadn't known about the boots. She went and looked, and there they were heavy elk leather, properly fitted, with extra wool lining that Barty had measured by tracing her foot on paper when she was sleeping the second day. She stood on the porch holding them and thought about the fact that these men had made her boots while she was unconscious and left them without saying anything, and she had to work to keep her face neutral because the practical kindness of it hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. The tracking lessons became a morning routine. Jessie was a different kind of teacher than she was quiet, demonstrative, patient. He didn't explain things so much as show them, and he waited for her to ask questions rather than anticipating them. She learned to read the difference between a disturbed track and a fresh one. She learned which animals came to the creek at different hours and how to find a trail that had been obscured by wind and why the trees on the north slope were different species than the trees on the south because slope and sun exposure created entirely different microclimates within a quarter-mile of each other. Your people, she said one morning, as they stood watching a fox cross the lower field. She paused, trying to phrase it right. Your mother's people. Is this how they taught? Jesse was quiet for a moment. My mother taught me to watch before speaking, he said. Most of what I know I learned from watching. He paused. The Nez Perce read the land the way your bookkeepers read a ledger. Everything leaves a record. You just have to know the language. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The evenings changed at Iron Ridge in ways that none of the four of them remarked on directly. Before Evie, according to Barty, the brothers ate fast and spent evenings doing separate things. Tad reading or cleaning equipment, Jesse outside or sharpening tools, Barty in his workshop. Now, without any planning, they ended up at the table together after supper most nights. Evie did figures or wrote letters. Barty worked on small carvings or sketched designs. Jesse cleaned his rifle or worked on a piece of tack. Tad read. They talked, not about important things necessarily, about the ranch, about the weather, about the cattle. Barty told stories which were long and digressive and generally ended in a place nobody had expected. Jesse occasionally said something sharp and accurate that made Evie laugh before she decided to. Tad asked questions. He asked a great many questions about Boston, about her father, about what she'd studied, and who had taught her. He also started shaving every evening. She pretended not to notice. All three of them washed before supper. This appeared to have been a unilateral and unannounced decision, implemented without discussion, because she'd been there for 5 days before she realized she had never yet sat down to a meal with a man who smelled like the outdoors. When she mentioned it to Barty, because Barty was the one she could mention things to without causing a serious social event, he said, matter-of-factly, Tad said, a woman deserves to eat in clean company. Then he went back to his carving. She decoded the ledger properly on the 12th day. She'd been working through Kincaid's Green Book in the evenings, systematically, working out the abbreviations and the cipher he'd used for names. He hadn't been especially careful about it. He was clearly a man who believed he was too powerful to need to be, and his bookkeeping habits were, ironically, similar enough to legitimate accounting that she could read most of it through context. What she found went beyond bribery. Kincaid had acquired 11 separate homestead properties over the past 4 years through manufactured debt schemes identical to the one he'd tried to use on her. He had a standing payment to Sheriff Orson Briggs, monthly, consistent, large enough to buy a man's entire conscience with room to spare. A circuit court clerk who had apparently been altering land transfer documents for 18 months. And the women's names in the back, those were real, those were dated, and some of those dates were recent enough that some of those women might still be in Silver Ridge. She sat with that knowledge for a full evening, staring at the fire. Then she went and found Tad. He was in the main room, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she came in and put the book down without being asked, which was a thing she had noticed he did. He put things down when people came to him, completely, without keeping a finger in the page or finishing a sentence. It was a small thing. She thought it was probably not a small thing. She set the ledger on the table between them, open to the women's names. He's not just looking for me because I ran, she said. He's looking for me because if I get this to a federal marshal, I can hang him. She put her finger on the columns. 11 women, manufactured debts, the same mechanism. He used to take 11 homestead properties from families who didn't know they had any legal recourse. She looked up. Kincaid isn't a local problem. He's a federal crime. Tad looked at the pages. He looked at her. His jaw was set, and his eyes had gone to that particular stillness that meant he was fully engaged with something, and had decided what he thought about it. "Does he know you can read all of this?" he said. "He knows I took the book," she said. "He doesn't know I'm a bookkeeper. He probably assumed I grabbed it by instinct, and I have no idea what any of it means." "That's an advantage," Tad said, "and we need to keep it. We also need to think about those women," she said. "The ones still in Silver Ridge. One thing at a time," he said. But he said it like a man making a list, not like a man dismissing something. "First, we get to spring. First, we get you safe," she was going to argue. Then she looked at his face, the scar, the steadiness, the particular weight of a man who had seen enough consequence to know that sequence mattered, and she let it go for tonight. "All right," she said. Spring. Outside, the mountains held their snow and their silence, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them moved to leave, and the lamp burned low between them on the table. The warm wind came down from the Sawtooth Range on a Thursday. Evie woke to the sound of dripping and thought, confused and half asleep, that the roof had begun leaking. She lay there for a moment listening to it, a steady, insistent drip, drip, drip from multiple points, before she understood that it was not the roof but the eaves, and that the eaves were dripping because the snow that had packed itself against the upper edges of every surface on Iron Ridge was melting. In February, she pulled on her clothes and her elk leather boots and went outside and stood on the porch. The air was soft. That was the only word for it, soft, and moving, and carrying a temperature that had no business being in Idaho in February. To the south, the sky was clear and pale gold. The Chinook was a real phenomenon. She knew that intellectually. Warm Pacific air, diving down the eastern slope of the Rockies and compressing as it came, shedding moisture and gaining heat until it arrived in the high valleys like a visitor from another season entirely. She knew it, intellectually. Feeling it on her face after 6 weeks of brutal cold was something else. Tad appeared beside her. He'd been up already, had probably been up for an hour. "How long does it last?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3, he said. "Then it goes back to cold. But while it's here, everything opens up." He was looking south, toward the lower trail, and his voice was even. But his eyes were moving, the way Jesse's eyes moved when he was tracking, alert, and continuous, checking things off a list. She understood why after another moment. The trail to the ranch was currently buried under snow and ice. The Chinook that felt like a gift to her skin was, to Tad, a door-opening one that opened from both directions. Jesse left for the lower trail after breakfast. He was scouting, he said, checking what the melt had done to the southern fence line, seeing what the warm air had moved or revealed. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. He took his horse and his rifle and his quiet competency and went down the mountain, and Evie watched him go from the workshop doorway, where she'd been helping Barty check the load calculations on the new hay door mechanism. The morning passed. The dripping continued. The snow came off the barn roof in long, sliding sheets, landing with sounds like muffled gunshots in the yard below. Barty was installing the corrected counterweight assembly on the barn's upper door, narrating the process to himself in a low, pleased murmur as he worked. He'd been like this since she'd shown him the structural mathematics energized, building faster, pausing to recalculate things from older projects, and discovering that his intuition had been right most of the time, which delighted him and made him simultaneously more confident and more precise. She handed him bolts when he asked for them, and listened to the warm wind move through the pines and thought about Kincaid's ledger and the 11 names in the back and what spring might actually bring. She heard the horse before she saw it, a single horse, coming up from the south trail at a pace that was wrong, too fast for easy terrain, too irregular for a deliberate gallop. She came out of the barn and saw it clear the tree-lined Jesse's roan mare, coming hard, saddle empty, reins trailing. Jesse was not on her. The saddle was dark on the left side. She registered that before she registered anything else, before she understood what she was seeing. The leather was soaked through in a way that was not meltwater. She was running for the house before she'd made a conscious decision to run. Tad. He came out of the equipment shed with a wrench in his hand and took in the horse in one look. His face did not change. That was the most alarming thing. His face went completely still. The way a face goes still when a person is controlling something very large, very deliberately. Barty. His voice was loud and entirely level. Get her inside. I'm not going inside, Evie said. He looked at her just briefly. Then he nodded. Once, and turned to catch the roan's reins, running his hand down the mare's neck to calm her before he looked at the saddle. He touched the dark leather. He brought his fingers up and looked at them, and said nothing for a moment. How bad, Evie said. Can't know yet, he said. But his jaw had set tight. They had no time to discuss it further, because that was when the sound of hooves came from the opposite direction from the front gate, from the main approach that came up through the lower meadow, from the county road, and Tad's head came up and around with the trained precision of a man who had spent years identifying threats by sound. 2 horses, measured pace, official pace. Evie looked at Tad. He looked at the front gate. Then he looked at the barn, clearly calculating Jesse's horse. Jesse gone, no way to know. And she could see him weighing the variables in real time, the same way she'd watched him assess cattle prices and weather patterns, except this time, the variables were not cattle and weather. He handed the roan's reins to Barty. Put her in the barn. Don't come out. Barty took the reins with wide eyes and did what he was told. 2 riders came through the front gate. One was a wide man with a badge on his coat brass, county issue, catching the thin February sun, and a face that Evie disliked immediately and specifically, not from personal experience, but from the particular quality of ease he wore, the ease of a man accustomed to no one pushing back. The other rider was younger, leaner, with a neutral expression and alert eyes that moved across the ranch property, with a different quality observational rather than proprietary. Thorne, the wide man said, by way of greeting. That wasn't one. Briggs, Tad said. Same tone, Sheriff Orson Briggs. She knew the name from the ledger. Monthly payments, consistent, a specific figure she had memorized because she memorized figures automatically. She kept her face still and her hands at her sides and stood where she was. Briggs looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he believes belongs to him by prior arrangement. "That's her," he said, to no one in particular. Then to Tad, "Evelyn Montgomery. We have a warrant for her arrest." "On what charge?" Tad said. "Not a question." A challenge, wearing a question's clothes. Briggs reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Theft and murder." He held it up without riding closer, which told her he was not especially interested in Tad, examining it carefully. "Man she stabbed at Bitter Creek died of infection. That makes her a murderer under territorial law. And she took property belonging to Mr. Cyrus Kincaid when she ran." He looked at Evie again. "You'll come peaceable, miss." "She's not going anywhere," Tad said. His voice had not changed in volume. It had changed in quality. Something had been removed from it, some accommodation, some ordinary social softening, and what was left was pure and cold and final. He had the Winchester in his hands. She didn't see him bring it up. It was simply suddenly there, held across his body, not pointed, but present. Briggs's horse shifted. The younger rider, the deputy, she assumed, put his hand up, not reaching for his gun, but making the gesture visible, a signal to everyone present that he was not escalating. Evie looked at Tad with his rifle and Briggs with his warrant, and she understood what was happening, the full shape of it, all at once. Tad was going to hold that line. He was going to hold it, because he'd said she was safe here, and he was a man who meant what he said, and the direct consequence of him meaning what he said was that he was about to fire on county law enforcement, while his brother was somewhere on the south trail bleeding into the snow. She stepped forward. "Tad," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. His eyes were on Briggs. "Tad," she said it again. "Steady. Put the rifle down. I'm going to handle this." A long moment. The warm wind moved through the yard. The snow dripped off the eaves. He looked at her then. Something crossed his face, not doubt, but a recalibration. A man who was deciding whether to trust. She held his eyes and didn't look away, and tried to put everything she needed him to understand into the steadiness of her face. He lowered the Winchester. Not all the way, but enough. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked up at Sheriff Orson Briggs, and she thought about the ledger, and she thought about 11 women's names, and she thought about a man who paid a county sheriff monthly for exactly this kind of service, and she let herself feel the full clarity of what she knew. "May I see that warrant, Sheriff?" Briggs looked surprised that she'd asked. He rode a few steps closer and held it out. She took it. She read it. It was, she determined, in about 45 seconds, not correctly drawn. She looked up at the deputy, who had been watching her read with focused attention. He was the younger one, early 30s, with an honest face and the bearing of someone who was in this situation, because his job had put him here, not because he had chosen it. "Deputy," she said. "What's your name?" "Miller," he said. "Ethan Miller." "Deputy Miller," she said. "This warrant has not been signed by a circuit court judge. It bears Sheriff Briggs's signature and a county commissioner's seal. But territorial law requires judicial authorization for a murder warrant. This document does not meet that standard." She turned it to show him the signature block. "It's not valid." Briggs's face had gone dark. "That warrant is perfectly beyond the procedural defect," she continued, and she did not raise her voice. "I want to direct Deputy Miller's attention to a separate matter." She reached into her coat and produced the green ledger. She held it up. "This is Cyrus Kincaid's private accounts book. It includes a record of monthly payments made to Sheriff Orson Briggs, most recently 3 weeks ago, in the amount that I believe Deputy Miller will find consistent with what I'm about to tell him." She looked at Miller directly. This warrant was not issued because a man died of infection. It was issued because Cyrus Kincaid needs this book back before it reaches a federal marshal. The yard was very quiet. Miller looked at the ledger. He looked at Briggs. Something was moving behind his eyes, the careful, uncomfortable process of a man who had suspected something for a long time and was now being asked to act on it in front of witnesses. "Sheriff Briggs," he said slowly, I'm going to need to see that warrant myself. Ethan, sir. Miller's voice was not loud, but it was firm, with a firmness that sounded like it had been building for a while. I'm going to need to see it. Briggs looked at Evie on the porch. His face had the rigid, furious quality of a man who was used to compliance and had encountered something that didn't comply. He looked at Tad, who was still holding the Winchester at low ready. He looked at Miller, who was holding out his hand for the warrant with the polite, implacable expression of a man who had made a decision. Fall back, Briggs said. It came out between his teeth. He wheeled his horse. Miller held Evie's gaze for one more moment. He gave a small nod acknowledgement, not agreement, not yet, but acknowledgement of what she'd shown him and what it might mean. Then they were gone. Back down the front approach, out through the gate, onto the county road. Tad was beside her before the sound of hoofbeats had cleared the tree line. Jessie, he said. That was all. Jessie, she agreed. Barty came out of the barn at a run. They went for him together, the three of them, because there was no version of this where any of them stayed behind. The south trail was soft and wet and treacherous from the melt. They found the evidence of the blast a quarter-mile below the ranch boundary, a section of the trail, where the snow had been violently rearranged, trees stripped of bark on the uphill side, the distinctive chemical bite of blasting powder still faint in the warm air. Kincaid's men had used mining dynamite to bring the slope down across the trail, and they'd done it while Jessie was on it. They found the mine shaft entrance another 100 yards off the trail, half concealed by scrub pine. The door was not locked. Tad went in first with a lantern. Jessie was alive. He was conscious, barely, sitting with his back against the shaft wall and his rifle across his knees, because even half buried by an avalanche he had held onto his rifle. He had a gash across his left temple that had bled dramatically, the way head wounds did, and his left shoulder was wrong dislocated, she assessed, from the angle of it. His face was gray, and he was cold, but his eyes were open and tracking. When Tad crouched in front of him and put a hand on his good shoulder, Jessie said, with considerable effort and no preamble, 4 of them, Kincaid's men. They didn't stay to check. He paused for breath. Their mistake. Tad made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Evie was already unpacking what she'd brought from the barn. She had learned from 2 months in a house with men who treated preparation as a moral position to bring what might be needed rather than hope for the best. Outside the shaft, the Chinook continued to blow down from the sawtooth peaks, warm and relentless, dissolving the mountain snow in long rivulets that ran together and made the creeks loud and fast. The door between winter and whatever came next was open. And Cyrus Kincaid, somewhere below on the county road, now knew exactly where to find them. They made it back to the ranch before dark. Jessie was conscious for most of the walk, which was something. He leaned on Tad's right side and kept his jaw set, and didn't complain once, which Evie was learning was just how Jessie handled pain by refusing to acknowledge it as a subject worth discussing. The dislocated shoulder would have to wait until they were inside and had light and to something for him to bite down on. Barty had water heating before they cleared the door. They got Jessie to the kitchen table. Tad sat across from him and talked him through what was about to happen in a low, direct voice, no softening, no apology, just information, and Jessie nodded once and gripped the table edge. Tad reset the shoulder in one clean motion. Jessie made a sound through his teeth and then went quiet again. Done, Tad said. I know, Jessie said. He'd already reached for the cloth Evie held out. She cleaned the head wound herself. It looked terrible and wasn't, which was the usual story, with scalp lacerations, lots of blood, shallow cut, no danger of anything serious. She'd asked Barty to teach her to stitch 2 weeks ago after a fence repair accident that had cost him a slice across his palm, and she was glad she had. 7 stitches, close and even. Jessie sat still for all of them. You should sleep, she said. I'll sleep. When Kincaid's in federal custody, Jessie said. He looked up at her. The gray had gone from his face, and the color was coming back, slow but real. Good stitching. Thank you, she said. Don't pull them. Tad was standing at the window, looking out at the dark. The Chinook had started to cool at the edges, the way it always did on the second day, still warm, but with a reminder in it that winter hadn't actually gone anywhere. He turned from the window. They'll come in the next day or two, he said, while the trail's still clear enough. He looked at Evie. What happened out front today with Miller? Do you think it held? I think it bought time, she said honestly. Miller's not corrupt. He knows the warrant was wrong, but knowing something and acting on it are different problems. She sat down across the table from Jesse. What Briggs told Kincaid tonight will matter more than what I told Miller. Briggs will say she's at Iron Ridge. She has the ledger. She talked to Miller. That's when Kincaid decides to stop relying on county law. Barty, at the stove, said quietly, so he comes himself. He sends more men, Tad said. Men who aren't carrying badges. Jesse reached for the coffee mug Barty set in front of him. Then we get ready, he said. And somebody needs to get that ledger to Miller before Kincaid gets to Miller first. They were up until midnight, working out the shape of it. She went to bed with her door locked, and the derringer on the nightstand, and the ledger under the mattress where she slept, and she thought about Miller's nod in the yard. That small, careful acknowledgement. She'd read men wrong, before she'd read her uncle wrong, had read the advertisement in the newspaper as legitimate when it was nothing but a paper trap. But she didn't think she'd read Miller wrong. He'd looked at the warrant, and then at Briggs, and something in his face had shifted. The shift of a scale tipping. She dressed before dawn. She came into the kitchen and found Tad already there, writing at the table with the concentrated economy of a man who did not enjoy writing, but understood its necessity. I need to go to town, she said. He looked up. Absolutely not. Not to Silver Ridge, she said. To Hardwick, the county seat. Miller lives and works there. Not in Silver Ridge. Kincaid keeps the Silver Ridge office under Briggs because it's convenient. Miller files reports out of Hardwick. If I go now, while the trail is soft and Kincaid's men are likely still reorganizing, I can get to Miller before Briggs does. You can't ride the South Trail alone. Then come with me, she said. Both of you. Barty can hold the ranch. Tad looked at her for a long moment. Jesse can't ride. Jesse is going to tell me I'm right, and you're being stubborn, she said, which I would prefer to confirm before we spend another 20 minutes on this. As if on cue, Jesse appeared in the doorway from the back bedroom, moving carefully, but moving. He looked at Evie. He looked at Tad. He said, go. Tad set down his pen. They rode out at first light, Evie and Tad, down the South Trail, while it was still soft enough to travel and cold enough not to be treacherous, the trees dripping steadily on either side, the mountains, enormous and pale, above the tree line. Tad rode ahead, and slightly to her left, which she had noticed, was his habit positioning himself between her and whatever was downhill, whatever was unknown. She'd stopped finding it irritating and started finding it simply true. The same way a wall is true. It exists. It does what it does. They reached Hardwick before noon. Miller was in his office. He stood up when Evie walked in, and she could see by his face that he'd spent the night thinking about the day before. There was a specific quality of tiredness to him that wasn't about sleep. Miss Montgomery, he said. She set Kincaid's ledger on his desk and opened it to the page with Briggs's payments. She didn't preamble it. Monthly payments, 18 months, everyone recorded with date and amount. Cross-reference against the county pay records for Sheriff Briggs, and you'll see a second income that doesn't come from the county. She turned to the land acquisition pages. 11 homestead properties acquired through manufactured debt over 4 years. I can walk you through each one. The legal mechanism Kincaid used is identical every time he creates a debt the family doesn't know they owe, calls it due, and takes the property when they can't pay. She turned to the women's names. These are not employees. I know what they are, because I nearly became one. Miller looked at the pages. He looked at them for a long time, the way a man looks at something he already half knew and is now being asked to fully know. If I take this to the circuit court, he said carefully, and it goes to Federal, Briggs will know it was you. Briggs already knows it was me, Evie said. What Briggs doesn't know is that I've already had this conversation with you, and that you're the kind of lawman who keeps copies. She paused. You do keep copies. Miller looked at her. Then, slowly, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a logbook and a pen. Start from the beginning, he said. I want everything dated and witnessed. Tad stood by the door with his hat in his hands and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Sometimes the most useful thing a man could do was take up space in a room and let someone else do the work they were built for. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon, the trail firming up as the Chinook began its slow retreat. The light came sideways through the pines and turned the meltwater on the rocks bright and brief. Evie rode beside Tad this time, not behind him, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence was the easy kind, the kind that comes after something has been done, not before. You didn't need me in there, Tad said eventually. I needed you at the door, she said. He considered that. Fair, he said. When they got back, Jesse was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and one of Barty's catalogs of timber prices, making notes in the margin with his good hand. He looked up when they came in, read their faces, and nodded. Miller, he said. He'll move, Evie said. Federal, not county. It'll take a few days. Jesse set down the catalog. Then Kincaid moves first, he said. He's not going to wait to find out what Miller does. No, Tad said. He's not. Barty came in from the workshop with sawdust on his shoulders and a look of focused calm. Then we'd better be ready, he said. He went to the kitchen, poured 4 cups of coffee, and set them on the table. Because I've been thinking about those tunnels all afternoon, and I have some ideas. Jesse's color was good by the second day. The stitches held clean, the shoulder worked if he didn't push it, and his appetite came back in a way that Barty took as a personal victory. He made elk stew that evening, thick and slow-cooked, with the dried sage Evie had reorganized into labeled jars 2 months ago. The kitchen smelled like warmth itself. They ate without talking much. Outside, the Chinook's last breath moved through the pines, and the temperature was dropping. They could feel it in the way the dripping from the eaves slowed, and then stopped, and by morning, the trail would likely be frozen again. Kincaid's window for an easy approach was closing, or maybe it was opening. Frozen ground was harder to move through and harder to hear. After supper, Barty stayed at the table, sketching the final placement of the tunnel, exits on a piece of paper, checking measurements against the figures he'd kept in his head for 3 years. Jesse took the paper from him, studied it, suggested a different angle on the east exit lower slope, better cover, and Barty immediately began redrawing. Tad sat by the fire with the Winchester disassembled across his knees, cleaning it with the methodical focus he brought to any task that needed to be done correctly. Evie sat at the far end of the table and did not do anything for a little while, which was unusual enough for her that she noticed it. She looked at the 3 of them. Barty bent over his drawings, murmuring to himself. Jesse watching the paper with his steady, patient eyes, pointing once with one finger to indicate a line. Tad's hands moving through the familiar work of the rifle's mechanism, confident and sure. She thought about Kincaid's ledger, which was now in Miller's logbook, as witness testimony. She thought about 11 names in a column. She thought about her uncle's debt, which had never been real, and the advertisement in the Boston newspaper, which had been real enough to bring her here. She thought about a blizzard, and a shack with a bad roof, and a fire she'd lit herself. She thought, I came here to survive. I think I may be doing something more than that now. The fear was still present. She wasn't pretending otherwise. Kincaid was going to come, and soon, and they all knew it. But underneath the fear, there was something solid and low and steady, like a foundation she hadn't known she was building. These 3 men, this table, this ranch that she had entered as a ledger, to be settled and had somehow started to understand as home. She loved all 3 of them. She worked that out slowly, And honestly, the way she worked out columns, not because she'd been looking for it, but because the numbers had been building for a while, and the total was simply true. Tad, who had put a gun in her hand and told her to use it if she needed to. Jessie, who had taught her to read snow and wait before speaking. Barty, who had left boots on the porch without saying anything, because kindness that needed announcing wasn't really kindness. Each of them filled something she'd carried empty for a long time without realizing it was supposed to hold weight. She got up from the table. "Hey," she said. Barty looked up first, then Jessie. Tad set the Winchester parts down and turned to look at her. She looked at all three of them and didn't dress it up. "I need you all to stop what you're doing for a minute," they did. Barty set down his pencil. Jessie's hands went still. Tad waited. "I don't know what happens tomorrow," she said. "I know what we've planned, and I think the plan is good, and I still don't know what happens. I've been sitting here thinking about that, and what I figured out is—" She paused, not because she was uncertain, but because the words were large, and she wanted to say them right. "I figured out that I'd rather spend whatever time we have before that being honest than careful." The room was quiet. The fire moved. "I love you," she said. "All three of you. Differently, but all the way." Nobody said anything. For a moment the fire crackled. A log shifted. From outside, the last of the Chinook moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Tad stood up from his chair by the fire. He crossed the room slowly, and when he reached her, he went down on one knee, not performing it, not dramatizing it, and took her hand in both of his. He pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, where the pulse was, where he'd checked for her pulse in Kettle's shack with 2 fingers, and felt something unlock in him. He stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed. "Evie," he said. Just that. She put her free hand on the side of his face. Jessie came to her from the left, quiet as always, and took both her hands from Tad and held them. And he looked at her the way he looked at a trail. Fully, completely, without anything held back. He lowered his head until his forehead touched hers. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, against her ear, with the dark, careful tenderness of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, "You walked into a blizzard rather than let someone own you. You think I don't know what that is?" "Jessie," she breathed. "I know exactly what that is," he said. Barty had come to stand behind her. His hands settled on her shoulders with the lightness of someone who is very aware of his own size. Always careful, always warm. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, the way you'd comfort something you treasured without knowing quite how to say it. "You organized our ledgers," he said, muffled slightly in her hair. "That was the moment for me. 4 days in, and you already cared about this place more than we did." She laughed, brief and real, and felt the laugh shake something loose in her chest. What came after was quiet. Not desperate, not frantic, the opposite of desperate. They move together the way people move when they've decided something, and don't need to perform it for anyone. Tad's hands, careful and reverent, learning the shape of her the way he learned anything thoroughly, slowly, with his whole attention. Jessie close beside her, his voice low and steady in her ear, a murmur of dark and honest words that she would carry with her long after that night. Barty's warmth behind it all, solid and gentle, his mouth soft on hers, his hands checking always that she was well, that she was sure, that she was here by choice. She was here by choice. That was the whole of it. That was what made it what it was. At the center of all of it was her not divided, not pulled between competing claims, simply herself, full and known, surrounded by 3 men who had looked at her clearly from the beginning and decided she was worth protecting, not because she was fragile, but because she mattered. They weren't jealous of each other. There was no edge in the room, no competition, just the 4 of them, honest and whole, choosing this together. Afterward, the fire had burned low. The cold had fully returned outside. She could feel it at the window glass when she passed but inside Iron Ridge. The warmth held steady. Jessie was asleep in the chair. Barty had gone to his room. Tad sat by the low fire with his arm around her, her head against his shoulder, and they didn't speak for a long time. "Whatever comes in the morning," he said finally. "I know," she said. She did know. She also knew that whatever came, she would face it in this house, with these men, as a person who had chosen and been chosen. Not a debt, not a name in a column, not a prize or a possession or an arrangement. Partner, an equal, a sovereign of this small piece of the mountain. Outside, the Sawtooth Range held its cold and its silence. The trail below was frozen hard again, and somewhere on the county road, Cyrus Kincaid was running out of patience. They came before dawn. Evie heard them first, not hoofbeats, but the absence of night sound. The creak had been loud all week from the melt. At some point, in the dark hours before first light, it went quiet in the way things go quiet, when there are men moving through the trees and the animals have gone still around them. She was out of bed with the derringer in her hand before she'd fully processed the thought. She knocked twice on Tad's door. He opened it, already dressed, already armed, already awake. She pointed toward the tree line. He listened. He nodded. 3 minutes later, all four of them were in the kitchen, with the lamps dark and the shutters cracked 2 inches, enough to see the yard. 12 men came out of the trees. They spread across the front approach in a line, deliberate and practiced, the formation of people who had done this kind of thing before. 3 carried torches. 2 had long rifles. The rest had revolvers, and the particular unhurried movement of men who believed the numbers were on their side. Cyrus Kincaid rode at the back of the line on a gray horse. He didn't carry a weapon himself. He wore a coat that cost more than the ranch's monthly feed bill, and he sat in the saddle the way men sit when they've never once considered losing. Barty was already moving toward the back of the house, quiet and fast, heading for the tunnel access panel he'd cut into the workshop, floor 2 years ago, built originally for winter emergency access to the supply cellar, now the backbone of the defense he'd been redesigning in his head for the past 3 days. He'd spent yesterday afternoon repositioning the lumber stack triggers on the east and south approaches. He'd showed Evie each mechanism twice, walking her through the release sequence until she could do it without thinking. "I'll take the roof," Tad said. Jesse checked the load on his rifle with a good hand. "Careful, but quick." "South window," he said. He looked at Evie. "Ammunition, medical, and the door," she said, before he could say it. She'd already worked out her position. The kitchen had 3 defensible angles, a solid iron stove that could stop a rifle ball, and access to the boiling water she'd started on the wood stove 20 minutes ago. From habit, thinking it might be needed, she was starting to think like the mountain. It suited her. Kincaid called from the yard. His voice was smooth and unhurried and carried well. "Thorne, I know she's in there. Send the woman out with the ledger and I'll leave your building standing." A pause. "This doesn't have to be your problem." Nobody answered him. That was the answer. The first dynamite charge went off on the east side, low and deliberate, not a killing shot, a warning. It took the corner of the chicken coop and threw a shower of timber into the yard. 2 of Evie's laying hens made considerable objection. Evie noted the direction and the distance and filed it. Barty's counterweight mechanism on the barn's upper door gave a loud mechanical clunk from somewhere outside, which meant he'd triggered the first lumber trap. From the tree line came a shout, then silence. 1 man down, possibly 2. Tad's rifle opened up from the roof. Measured, spaced shots, not spray, not panic, but the deliberate fire of a man who had scouted his angles before taking position, who knew where each of the 12 men had spread in the yard, who was choosing his targets with the patience of someone who had done this in worse conditions than this, and considered it a skill, not a mood. 2 of Kincaid's men broke for the barn. Barty's second trap caught them at the barn door, a cross-beam release that swung a stacked wall of short lumber in a fast arc at knee height. She heard the results. Both men went down. Neither got back up quickly. The torches worried her more than the guns. Kincaid hadn't thrown them yet. He was holding them, which meant they were leverage, meant for a specific moment probably, when the rifle fire slowed, when he decided the brothers were running low. She watched the torch carriers from the cracked shutter and counted seconds between Tad's shots. 4 men tried the south wall. Jesse took 2 of them from the south window. The other 2 made it to the wall itself and started working on the shutter with a pry bar, which was their mistake. The shutters were reinforced with iron brackets Barty had installed last fall, and they weren't coming off fast. Jesse was already repositioning. The 3rd man reached the back door, then the 4th. She heard them hit the door, not knocking, a hard shoulder impact, then another. The bar on the door was iron. It held. She moved to the kitchen's east-facing wall and stood with her back to it, the derringer up, the boiling water pot on the hook within arm's reach. The door held through 4 impacts. On the 5th, the frame splintered at the top hinge. She swung the pot of boiling lye water through the gap before the door was fully open and heard the result clearly. The man on the other side fell back off the steps. The second one behind him pulled up short, which was long enough for Jesse to appear from the hallway, and put a shot through the doorframe that ended the discussion entirely. "You all right?" Jesse said. "Yes," she said. She reset her position. From the roof, Tad's rifle went steady again. Barty emerged from the tunnel access in the workshop and came around the east side of the main house at a low run, which was a thing none of them had planned and which therefore meant something had changed. He came through the back doorway with his face set tight. "They've got a mortar," he said. He was breathing hard. "Improvised looks like a mining charge set in a pipe mount. They're setting it up at the far tree line." "If they get a proper angle on the roof, Tad," Evie said. Barty was already moving for the stairs to the roof access. She heard him up there, heard the low, urgent exchange, heard Tad's boots shift position. 3 seconds later, Tad's fire moved, no longer covering the yard's center, now aimed at the tree line at the far left, where 3 men were crouched over something she couldn't see from the shutter. One of them ran. The other 2 went flat. The mortar didn't fire. Kincaid was still on his gray horse at the back of the yard. She could see him through the shutter. He had not moved. He watched his men fall back or go down or stop moving with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, calculating the remaining variables, deciding whether the cost had exceeded the return. 3 of his torchmen were still standing. He looked at them. He raised his hand. "Tad," she called. But Tad had already seen it. His rifle cracked twice from the roof, fast not at the torches, at the ground in front of the horses carrying the men. Both horses spooked and spun, and one torch went into the mud, and the other caught the fence rail at the yard's edge and burned there. Small and contained, reaching nothing. Kincaid's hand dropped. He looked at the ranch house for a long moment. He looked at the burned fence rail. He looked at the men he had left, which was fewer than he'd come with. Then he turned the gray horse and rode back into the trees. The remaining men followed. Some of them were slow about it. 2 had to be helped. The yard went quiet. On the roof, Tad's boots stopped moving. Evie let out a breath and set the empty lye pot down carefully on the floor and sat down in the kitchen chair and put her hands flat on the table and waited for them to stop shaking. They did, eventually. She gave them the time they needed. The back door had been broken. Barty was already looking at the hinge by the time the sun came up, turning the splintered frame in his hands with the professional irritation of a craftsman who has watched something he built be mistreated. "I can fix this in 2 hours," he said, to no one specifically. "I want to go on record that the bar held. It was the frame. The frame was always the weak point. And I told Tad that in November. You told me," Tad confirmed, from where he was checking the east yard for anything left behind. "You were right." "I was right," Barty said, with great satisfaction, and went to get his tools. Jesse was already at the tree line, moving slow through the pre-dawn light, reading what Kincaid's men had left in the snow: footprints, blood trails, the position of the mortar pipe they'd abandoned when Tad's fire pushed them back. He came back after 20 minutes and reported that 2 of the men had been carried out, and that the blood trail from the south approach went a 1/4 mile before stopping. which meant transport waiting on the lower road. Kincaid had planned his exit as carefully as his entrance. That told her something. Careful men didn't stop. They reorganized. They were eating breakfast, all four of them, because Barty believed strongly in eating after a crisis, and nobody was inclined to argue when they heard the horse in the back approach. One horse, walking, which was different from what 12 horses sounded like, and Evie's body registered the distinction before she consciously did. Jesse was at the window. Miller, he said. Two men with him. Federal, by the coats. Tad set down his coffee mug and stood up. They came into the yard, three of them, and Miller swung down from his horse and looked at the burned fence rail and the destroyed chicken coop and the still smoking debris from Kincaid's dynamite charge and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at the main house, at the door Barty was still repairing, at Evie standing on the porch. "You're alive," he said. "I am," she said. "Kincaid hit you last night." "He tried," she said. Miller introduced the two men with him, federal marshals out of Helena, sent down by the circuit court judge who had reviewed her testimony the day before. They had papers, real papers, with judicial signatures. She looked at them and confirmed quietly that they met the proper standard. She couldn't help it. The lawyer's instinct, Kincaid's fake warrant, had sharpened in her. Miller almost smiled. "They're real," he said. "I know," she said. "I was checking." Virgil Hawkins came around the east side of the barn at exactly the wrong moment. He'd circled back. She understood it. Afterward, Kincaid had sent him back for the ledger while the main group retreated, counting on the aftermath chaos to create an opening. He came around the corner fast with his revolver up, and he went straight for Evie, because Evie was the problem, had always been the problem, and he was a man who solved problems directly. She didn't run. She'd been carrying the Derringer since before dawn, and it was in her hand before he'd cleared the corner. And when he saw it, he hesitated half a second, a flicker of genuine surprise, the look of a man who had calculated she'd be unarmed by now. She shot him in the kneecap, point blank, deliberate, aimed exactly where she intended. He went down hard and loud, revolver skidding across the frozen mud, and was still swearing in a highly creative register when Jesse came around the other corner and landed on him with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He had Hawkins disarmed and pinned before the man had finished his second sentence. One of the federal marshals looked at Evie with an unreadable expression. "Good shot," he said, finally. "I was aiming for the kneecap," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I meant." Kincaid himself was found at the county road's lower junction, where his gray horse had thrown a shoe, and the going had slowed. Briggs was with him, which simplified the morning considerably. The federal marshals had papers for both of them. Tad and Miller rode down together to meet them. She watched them go from the porch, watched the tree line and the sky, and the long open slope of the mountain below the ranch boundary. The snow was thin at the lower elevations now, patchy, the dark earth showing through in long irregular strips. Spring was coming in for real this time. When Tad came back, he came alone. He rode into the yard and swung down and stood by his horse for a moment, looking at the ground. And then he looked up at the porch where Evie was standing. "Miller has them both," he said. "Federal custody. They'll transport to Helena for trial." She nodded. She'd known it was coming, and it still took a moment to land. Tad walked to the porch steps and stopped. He looked at her directly. "He's not dead," he said. He said it plainly, not as apology and not as regret. "Kincaid. He'll face a jury and a judge and a public accounting. Miller says the ledger is enough to convict on 6 federal counts minimum." He paused. "I had him cornered. In the slush, down at the junction. He was off his horse. Briggs had already folded." Kincaid looked at me like he expected. "What did you do?" she asked. "I put the gun away," he said. I told him, "The law in this territory isn't in your pocket, Kincaid. It's in the respect human beings hold for one another." He held her eyes steady. Then Miller arrived and took him. She stood with that for a moment. "You could have ended it faster," she said. "Yes," he said, But fast isn't the same as right. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her, both of them facing out at the mountain. Those 11 women deserve a trial on record. The families who lost their land deserve documented testimony. Shooting Kincaid in a ditch gives them nothing. Putting him in front of a federal court gives them a case they can point to. She looked at the Sawtooth Range above them, white-peaked still, enormous and permanent above everything that had happened at the base of it. You knew that before you went down there, she said. I did, he said. I just needed to hold to it when I was standing in front of him. Behind them, from inside, came the sound of Barty singing to himself while he worked on the door hinge, off-key and cheerful, which had been a constant feature of Iron Ridge for as long as she'd known it. Jesse appeared at the east corner, moving along the fence line with his easy, ground-reading walk, checking the posts. The mountains held their cold and their silence and their extraordinary indifference to everything human happening at their feet. Evie took a breath of clean March air. The reckoning was done. May came to the Sawtooth Range, the way it always did, not suddenly, but incrementally, each morning a few degrees warmer than the last. The snow retreating up the peaks in slow stages, until only the highest ridges were still white against a sky that had finally decided to be blue. Iron Ridge Ranch was loud in May. The creek was up and fast from the snowmelt. The barn had the second hay storage level now, the ramp working exactly as Barty's corrected calculations had predicted. One person could operate the counterweighted doors without breaking a sweat. The east fence had been rebuilt after the siege damage, straighter than it had been before, because Barty considered the whole thing an opportunity. 3 new horses were in the south pasture. The ledgers, current and clean and organized by quarter, sat on the kitchen shelf in a row. The wedding was Evie's idea, and also not exactly a wedding, she'd said, in February, sitting at the kitchen table while a blizzard made noise outside. If we do this, we do it right. I want a document. Not a church document, a legal one. Land and name and standing, all of it, written down and signed and witnessed. Tad had said, what kind of document? She had told him, and he had listened. And then he had found a lawyer in Hardwick who was willing to draft something that existed at the edge of territorial law and was better than nothing and would hold up to scrutiny, because Evie had written half of it herself. The deed transfer was signed the morning of the wedding. All 3 brothers at the kitchen table, the document spread between them, each of them signing in turn Thaddeus Thorne, Jesse Thorne, Bartholomew Clay, and beside each signature, a legal notation transferring 50% of Iron Ridge Ranch's total ownership to Evelyn Montgomery. She signed her own name beneath theirs. She signed it firmly and without pause. Jessie watched her sign and said, "It's done then, it's done," she said. The ceremony was on the porch, which was where they'd always done everything that mattered, where she'd stood with her derringer in her pocket and faced down Briggs's fraudulent warrant, where she'd watched Kincaid's men walk out of the tree line, where she'd stood beside Tad and looked at the mountains, and understood that the reckoning was finished. The porch was where Iron Ridge met the world, and it seemed right. Deputy Ethan Miller came. He'd been to Helena twice, since the arrest and back again, building the federal case that was going to put Kincaid and Briggs in front of a circuit court judge before summer's end. He stood at the porch rail and watched the proceedings with the particular solemnity of a man who understood what this gathering represented, not just 3 men and a woman, but a specific demonstration of what it looked like when people chose to do things right. 3 neighboring homesteaders came. 2 of them were families who had been on Kincaid's land acquisition list, but hadn't yet been approached. They knew now, because Miller had told them, and they'd come to sign depositions and stayed for the wedding, because Barty had specifically invited them, and Barty was very hard to say no to. 2 women came from Silver Ridge. Their names were Clara and May. They had reached out to Miller in March, after word had circulated through the territory that Kincaid's operation was finished and the federal case was real, and the women at his Silver Ridge house annex were free to leave. Miller had written to Evie. Evie had written back immediately. By April, Clara and May were at Iron Ridge, helping Barty and Jesse repair the outbuildings, and Clara had discovered she had a talent for the ranch's inventory management that Evie encouraged with the same patient, iterative teaching she'd given Barty with his structural mathematics framework first, then let the person find the work they were built for. 2 more women were expected by month's end. There were things that needed doing on a working ranch. There was room. Evie had done the numbers herself. If the east pasture was expanded and 2 more dairy cattle were brought in, the revenue increase would support 3 additional people at minimum wage with room to spare. She'd presented this to Tad with 3 sheets of calculations. He'd read them and said, "How soon?" she'd said. "As soon as we build the East Room addition." He'd looked at Barty. Barty had said, "Give me 3 weeks." The East Room was finished in 2.5. The ceremony itself was short. A circuit riding minister read the formal parts. She said her words to all 3 of them and meant every syllable. Barty cried briefly, and with no apparent embarrassment. Jesse didn't cry, but his jaw worked once, which was Jesse's equivalent. Tad held her hands in both of his and looked at her with the full weight of a man who had spent 12 years after the war believing he'd used up his portion of good things and had turned out to be wrong. He had their daughter in his arms before the minister had fully finished. She'd arrived 6 weeks early, which was not the plan, but she was healthy and loud and entirely uninterested in plans, which Evie considered a promising character trait. She had Evie's dark eyes and, apparently, Tad's opinion of wasted time. She had opinions already. At 6 weeks, and she expressed them without any reserve. When Tad held her on the porch, in front of the small crowd gathered on the steps and the yard, he looked at the neighbors, and at Miller, and at Clara and May, and at the mountains above all of them, and he said what he'd said he would say, plainly, to anyone who came to Iron Ridge and needed to know what kind of place it was. A wife isn't someone who walks behind a man. At Iron Ridge, she stands beside us as an equal partner and sovereign of this land. Nobody argued with it. Clara and May, standing at the edge of the porch, exchanged a look that carried a great deal of weight quietly. Miller gave a single nod, the same nod he'd given Evie in the yard back in February, acknowledgement real and solid. Barty was already at the kitchen table by the time the formal part ended, laying out the food he'd been cooking since before dawn, narrating the menu to anyone in earshot, because he was constitutionally unable to present a meal without explaining it. Jesse came to stand beside Evie at the porch rail, looking out at the pasture, the new horses moving slow and easy in the spring grass. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You still have the key," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen it on the cord around her neck that morning. "I kept it," she said. "I'll keep it." He looked at her and almost smiled, which on Jesse was as good as a laugh. "Good," he said. She looked out at Iron Ridge, the barn with its working upper door, the rebuilt fence, the East Room addition with its new window catching the afternoon light, the pasture, the creek loud with snowmelt, the mountains above everything. The sky was the particular blue that only arrived in the Idaho high country in May. Clean and high and almost unreasonably beautiful. She had come here on someone else's plan, on a manufactured debt and a false advertisement and an uncle's bad business. She had built something real out of the wreckage of that. Tad appeared at the door behind her. The baby tucked against his shoulder, her small fist curled against the collar of his good shirt. He came to stand beside Evie and didn't say anything, because he was a man who had learned, she'd watched him learn it over these months, that some moments were complete already and didn't need words added to them. The sunlight came across the sawtooth peaks and lay itself out across the yard in long stripes of gold, and the creek ran fast below, and somewhere in the kitchen Barty hit a high note on whatever song he'd decided to sing, and missed it and kept going anyway. Iron Ridge held. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. It's not the gunfight. It's not the blizzard. It's the moment Tad Thorne puts a loaded dare into Evelyn Montgomery's hand and says, use it if you need to. That's the whole story, right there, in one small gesture. Because every man who came before him had spent his life making her smaller. And this man, this rough, scarred, half-broken rancher at the edge of the world, handed her a weapon and called it hers. That's what this story is really about. Not the romance, not the frontier, not even the villain. It's about what it means to be chosen, not owned, not managed, not rescued, but genuinely chosen, as a full and capable human being. Evelyn didn't survive that blizzard because someone saved her. She survived because she lit the fire herself. She found the shack. She struck the match with frozen hands. And she kept going when stopping was the easier thing to do. The men of Iron Ridge didn't find a woman to complete them. They found a woman who was already complete and had the wisdom to recognize what that was worth. And I think that's the first lesson this story offers. Survival is not the ceiling. It's the floor. So many of us spend our lives just trying to get through the bad job, the bad relationship, the manufactured debt someone else put on our name. We call it enough. We call it fine. But Evelyn Montgomery walked into a blizzard and came out the other side owning half a ranch and building a life that was entirely, irrevocably hers. She didn't just survive what was done to her. She built something real from the wreckage of it. There is a profound difference between those two things, and this story asks you to feel that difference in your chest. The second thing this story says quietly, but it says it is that community is not weakness. Tad, Jesse, and Barty are three men who had been running a ranch like a wound. Competent, capable, and quietly incomplete. They needed a bookkeeper. What they found was someone who looked at their broken ledgers and their wrong calculations and their beautiful track drawings and said, I see what you're actually worth. Let me show you. And she needed them too. Not to be protected, to be witnessed, to be part of something. We are not built to be alone on our mountains, no matter how self-sufficient we think we are. Iron Ridge didn't work until all four of them were at the table. The third lesson is the one Tad teaches at the end, standing in the slush with a cornered man and a loaded gun. He puts the gun away, not because he's weak, because he's thought it through clearly enough to know that fast isn't the same as right. Those 11 women deserved a trial on record. The families who lost their land deserved documented testimony. A bullet in a ditch gives them nothing. A federal court gives them a case they can point to. Justice is slower than revenge. It costs more. It demands more of you. And it's worth every bit of that cost because it builds something that outlasts the moment. That's what Iron Ridge is at its core. Not a love story, though it is one. Not a Western adventure, though it's certainly that. It's a story about what happens when people decide to do things right in the way they treat each other, in the way they build their homes, in the way they face the men who try to take what isn't theirs. It's a story about a woman who refused to be a name in someone else's column, and three men who were better for knowing her, and a small piece of mountain that held, because the people on it chose to hold together. And maybe that's the thing worth carrying with you. After the last page. Not the drama of the siege, not the romance of the porch ceremony, but this, the life worth having is the one you build with clear eyes and honest hands, surrounded by people who see you fully and choose you anyway. Iron Ridge held. And so can you. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to real persons or historical events.